From TV, you've probably gotten the idea that there are DNA databases that police can use to track people down. But you probably haven't thought too much about what it actually takes to get entered into that DNA database. And it turns out in some cases, you might have no idea at all that you ended up there. Joining us now to break down one particular, pretty tragic story of this happening, Janika White, welcome to the Damage Report.
Thanks.
Glad to have you here. So there is a 12-year-old boy who ended up on this database. Can you tell us about his experience?
Well, from the article and the information that I've seen, he was arrested and being investigated for a felony. He was ultimately released and not convicted, and I don't even believe indicted. But his DNA was collected while he was in the custody of the police, and now he is now in a database in New York City, along with several other thousands of people, some who were arrested or even questioned, but not necessarily convicted.
And so, look, I've been reading about the growth of this DNA database and how many people are in it. It says 83,000 people just in this particular one. And it would seem to me like, look, if you are, like you're going to jail or something, they take a sample of your DNA. I sort of can understand that, but this seems like it would run afoul of the Constitution. Do we have any idea if in New York City, if in other parts of this country, simply taking this incidental DNA that you don't realize, you have no consent, is that actually legal to do?
Well, that's actually up for debate. The Supreme Court has not ruled specifically on a case such as this one. You have some different types of rulings. And in a lot of the cases, and of course, constitutionalists and different civil rights lawyers argue that it's a violation of your Fourth Amendment right against search and seizure. And in these particular instances, the way that we've seen the courts rule is that when you have abandoned property, for instance, the Supreme Court did rule sometime back that the police searching a man's trash, discarded trash, was not an illegal search, and they did not need a warrant. Well, you look at these situations where you may be in a police station and they offer you a glass of water or a drink, which is actually what happened to this 12-year-old. And once the 12-year-old left, they took the straw or the cup and they collected DNA and they compared it to whatever DNA they had from the crime scene. And then they put it into the database and they maintained it. And the parents now are fighting to have it removed from the database. The only cases that I was able to find recently where a court actually suppressed the information and said that it was an illegal search was one where a police officer went on a man's patio and kicked off a cigarette butt and collected his DNA. And another one was where a man was being questioned in a police station and the police officer intentionally swapped the water bottle and collected DNA off of the water bottle. In both those cases, the courts, the basis for them excluding that evidence was that in those two cases, the people had not discarded of those materials, and it was not really abandoned property, and they still had an expectation of privacy to it.
So we know that in the past few years, there's been a little bit more recognition for a lot of people about our information being gathered online, for instance, and that they might exist in these sorts of databases. People are taking that more seriously. I hadn't previously put much thought into these sorts of databases, but do we have any idea of, like for the 83,000 people who are on, for instance, just the New York's database, do we know if people are notified that they're being entered into it? The path to taking your information off of there if you feel like it never should have been put into the database in the first place? Like how much actual access and information do people have about these sorts of databases?
Well, that's interesting. In the article, actually, I think it's about 82,000 who are in the database, but 31,000 of the 82,000, which is about 40% of those people are people who were never convicted. And so these are people who were either questioned by police, arrested, or in some of these instances, a part of these, what they call dragnet databases. And that's where they go in the neighborhoods where you may have a serial rapist or a serial killer, and they request that you voluntarily provide your DNA. And in some of these cases that have been reported by several attorneys who are now litigating them in their different jurisdictions, the police may threaten, to hold you longer than necessary if you don't give your DNA, or they use these different tactics to kind of bully you into giving your DNA. And there are just a lot of concerns, of course, about the mass collection of this type of data. And of course, some compare it to fingerprinting, but of course, DNA, you're able to find out a lot more from DNA versus a fingerprint. A fingerprint serves for identification purposes only. And when you start talking about DNA, you're talking about some really valuable information beyond identification.
Yeah, and I guess people would just have to hope that these police departments would never provide the information to any other company that might look to profit off of it, or that there would never be a breach of their servers, a hacker taking the information, or some corporation taking the information. I mean, as you point out, it is not the same as a fingerprint. Sort of on the flip side, what is the argument made by the police for its use? Do we have any reason to believe that there is any good side to these? Have crimes been solved as a result of these databases?
Well, of course. I mean, DNA evidence, that's kind of the leading thing. Everyone's looking for that kind of smoking gun, especially after you have all of these shows. Of course, the police and proponents say that, if you're innocent, you don't have anything to hide, no harm, no foul. And of course, that's kind of our constant battle here now as technology develops, is making that balance between our privacy and our expectation of privacy and our safety. And of course, this was a large debate with the change with, airport security after 9/11. There's always this exchange in your expectation of privacy and the need to keep the public safe. And the police believe that, you won't be implicated or it won't be an issue unless you actually are indeed a criminal. But of course, we know that, it's not always true. And I think here, one of the deeper issues with the collection of DNA and the way that it was retained in the case in New York with the 12-year-old is just the distrust that it causes. And it kind of highlights that small portion of authorities and officers who can become overzealous and allude to tactics that just are not ones that are seemingly deceitful.
Yeah, a serious issue, and one that hopefully people will pay more attention to in the future. Janika White, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.